from prison inmates. Number 10. Thomas J. Grasso. Thomas J. Grasso was sentenced in April 1992 for the murders of two elderly people. Hilda Johnson, an 87-year-old woman in 1990, and Leslie Holtz, an 81-year-old man in 1991. Grasso committed these crimes to steal pension checks and petty cash, along with Hilda's television. Soon the police caught him and he was sentenced to death. For his last meal, Thomas asked for 24 steamed mussels, 24 steamed clams, a double cheeseburger from Burger King, a half dozen barbecued spare ribs, 2 strawberry milkshakes, 1/2 pumpkin pie with whipped cream, diced strawberries, and SpaghettiOs. While Grasso got most of what he ordered, the kitchen staff misunderstood his request and gave him spaghetti, not SpaghettiOs. In fact, his last words were to that effect. They were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." Well, Grasso got his wish, as his strange last words are now what he is most remembered for. Number 9. Ricky Ray Rector. Ricky Ray Rector was convicted for the murder of a club goer and a police officer in 1981. After a friend was refused entry to a club, Ricky Ray fired several shots into the club, taking 1 life and wounding 2 others. He then went on the run for 3 days before surrendering to police. However, instead of surrendering, he took the life of the officer sent to bring him in and then tried to take his own. The hospital was able to stabilize him and he was brought to trial. Though his legal defense argued that he was too intellectually impaired from the self-murder attempt to be able to withstand trial, but the judge refused the appeal. In 1992, Ricky Ray Rector had his final meal. He had steak, fried chicken, cherry Kool-Aid, and a slice of pecan pie. He ate everything except for the pie, and as he rose to attend his execution, he told the guards he was saving it for later. The pie was left undisturbed until after his life was taken, when it was discarded. Number 8. Philip Workman. In 1981, Philip Workman needed money to feed his addiction and decided to rob a Wendy's with a lethal weapon. An employee triggered a silent alarm and soon police were on the scene. Philip fled while in a shootout with police, and in the crossfire, Lieutenant Ronald Oliver was shot and lost his life. Philip was soon apprehended and sentenced to die. Though there was a significant lack of ballistic evidence tying Philip's firearm to Lieutenant Ronald Oliver's death, he was still convicted of the murder. In 2007, some 26 years after the crime, Philip was asked for his last meal request. Philip declined a last meal, but asked instead that a large vegetarian pizza be given to the homeless in the city. His request was denied, but in solidarity, dozens of people across the country bought pizzas for the local homeless population. Philip had spent a lot of time in prison thinking, and decided to make his final act one of kindness. Number 7. John Spenkelink. Following a murder and a string of armed robberies, John Spenkelink was arrested and brought to trial. He had taken the life of his partner in crime after they had argued over who would get what share from the recent robberies they had committed. He shot Joseph Semenkowitz, took the money, and went on the run just a few days after escaping prison. During the 1973 trial, John refused a plea bargain to plead guilty to second-degree murder, and instead insisted he had acted in self-defense. If he had taken the plea bargain, he would have been sentenced to life in prison, but since he fought the charges, he was sentenced to death. In 1979, his time came, and he was asked for his final order. John refused a meal, and instead asked for a flask of his favorite hard drink, which rhymes with Wax Spaniels. This he shared with a guard before sitting on the electric chair. The Jacksonville DJ Doug Tracht played the sounds of sizzling bacon and dedicated it to John. Desmond Keith Carter. At the age of 25, Desmond Keith Carter was heavily under the influence of multiple intoxicants when he ended the life of his 71-year-old neighbor, Helen Purdy. This had happened just a few days after Desmond's mother had tried to get him treatment from the local hospital for substance abuse and mental health issues. Desmond was denied by the hospital, however, as he did not have the insurance to cover it. In 1993, he was sentenced to death and 40 years imprisonment. 9 years later, in 2002, at the age of 35, Desmond had his final meal. Desmond actually declined to have a formal meal. Instead, he used his own money to buy 2 cheeseburgers, a steak sandwich, and 2 cans of Coca-Cola for $4.20, which was taken from his prison account. His last words were, "I love you, Pop," which he mouthed to his father moments before his end. Number 5. Susanna Margaretha Brandt. In 1770 Frankfurt, Susanna Margaretha Brandt was working at a hotel when a goldsmith from Holland entered. The two struck up a conversation, and soon Susanna was enraptured. The two spent an intimate night together before the goldsmith left for Russia the next day. Susanna would never see him again. Soon, Susanna realized she was pregnant. She was unwed, which was practically a death sentence in 18th century Germany, and had to hide her pregnancy. After a few months, the women around her began to notice and threatened to fire her, as having a child in secret was strictly illegal at the time. At 8 months, Susanna's water broke and she had to flee in the night. She miscarried and lost the child, which she hastily buried. She was caught by guards covered in blood and hysterical as she left the city, and she was brought to jail. The details were revealed to the judge, and soon she was sentenced to death for murder. Susanna was offered a massive feast of 3 pounds of bratwurst, 10 pounds of beef, 6 pounds of baked carp, 12 pounds of lamb roast, soup, cabbage, bread, a dessert, and 8 liters of wine. Sources differ on why, but Susanna was never given the feast. Instead, the officials who observed the trial and execution ate the feast. This story is especially tragic, and though the popular narrative is that she declined the meal, the cruelty with which she was treated makes me think differently. Number 4. Gerald Lee Mitchell. Gerald Lee Mitchell was doing a narcotics deal when everything went wrong. Details as to why are scant, but what is known is that Mitchell, 17, was dealing narcotics to Charles Marino, 20, and Kenneth Fleming, 15, when he aimed a lethal weapon at them and demanded they drive him to an abandoned building. He then robbed the pair and shot them. Fleming survived, but Marino didn't. Mitchell also later took the life of Hector Manguia after Manguia tried to steal a necklace from him. Mitchell was sentenced to 60 years for the murder of Marino and another 60 for the murder of Manguia. In 1986, Mitchell was sentenced to death. Mitchell made his last order in 2001 at 34. His request was a bag of assorted Jolly Ranchers. An unsettlingly innocent request. Jolly Ranchers are my favorite candy and what I would choose for my last meal. To me, that connection humanizes Mitchell. Mitchell used his last words to apologize to the families of his victims and to his own family before begging forgiveness from all families involved and God. Number 3. Roger Casement. Roger Casement was an Irish diplomat, nationalist, and humanitarian activist. In 1905, his Casement report was instrumental in exposing the gross human rights abuses occurring in the Belgian Congo under Leopold II. He was knighted in 1911 for his work uncovering human rights abuses at rubber plantations in Peru, and in 1904, Roger joined the Gaelic League, which was dedicated to preserving the Irish Gaelic language, and he was a strong supporter of the initial Sinn Féin party, which sought an independent Ireland through peaceful protest and striking. Soon, Roger was a prominent figure in the Irish Citizen Army, and helped smuggle in weapons and garner funds and support from the large Irish populations in America. 3 days before the Easter Rising, Roger was captured by the British Constabulary. When the Easter Rising kicked off, Roger was officially charged with sedition and terrorism. On the day of his execution, Casement asked that the English Catholic Church accept him as a Catholic, and his final meal was that of communion. Number 2. James Edward Smith. During a bank robbery in 1983, James Edward Smith would shoot and slay District Manager Larry Don Rojas. Rojas had complied with Smith's requests and gave him a plastic bag full of cash, but James Smith wanted more. He demanded Larry's watch and jewelry as well before ending Larry's life. After a foot chase, Smith tripped and was subdued by multiple civilians who held him in place until police arrived. After attempting to escape from the holding facility, Smith was sentenced to death. In an attempt to shorten the waiting time, Smith waived all right to appeal. He was a believer and a practitioner of voodoo and asked that his final meal be Rayakunda dirt. The eating of this dirt is supposedly a part of some voodoo practices, and Smith believed it would help his soul to be reincarnated. Dirt, however, is not on the list of approved last meal foods, so he was forced to settle for plain yogurt. I would think that you could have whatever you want as your final meal given that you're about to leave this earth, but apparently that isn't the case. I'd say, just give him the dirt. Number 1. Victor Feguer. Victor was a drifter and a career criminal. He was finally arrested and tried for the murder of Dr. Edward Bartels, whom he had lured to his residence at a decrepit boarding house under the ruse of some female relative needing medical attention. Victor kidnapped Dr. Bartels and carried him across state lines before ending his life. It is believed that Victor was driven by a desire to steal and use the various chemicals and substances carried by the doctor. For his 10 days on death row, Victor was a model prisoner. He had spent a long time thinking and claimed he had found peace. This was reflected in his last meal. Victor didn't ask for dozens of pounds of meat or a massive feast. Instead, he asked only for a single olive with a pit. It was his hope that after his death, the pit would be planted so that a tree of peace could grow. After his death, the olive pit was found in his suit pants pocket. It is unknown what happened to it, but some stories claim it was planted on the prison grounds and left to grow as Victor had wished. The strangeness and haunting beauty of Victor's unusual request and the